From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Thanks for listening. Eric Atkinson here. And coming up today, K-State's Keith Harmoney talking about the modified intensive early stocking approach to grazing the cow herd on summer grass. He's now into year 6 of studying the impacts of this grazing system on cow condition and pasture productivity. Then, from a recent Cattle Chat podcast out of the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State, comments on evaluating a pasture's cow herd carrying capacity and on avoiding grass tetany problems as the herd grazes that lush early summer grass. Featured K-State's Brad White, Bob Larson, and Bob Weaber. And further ahead, K-State's Charlie Lee on the extent of wild turkey damage to newly planted spring crops. Here on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. As always, thanks for being aboard. And opening up today's edition, a look at ongoing research at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hays. And this project took an idea that's been practiced a long while with stocker cattle in various parts of Kansas and has modified it to adapt it to grazing the cow herd. We're talking here about intensive early stocking of the cow herd. The rangeland scientist for K-State who's overseeing this work has been for several years now, Keith Harmoney. Well, Keith, explain first, before we go much further into your work, the whole concept of intensive early stocking of cattle. This emerged some years back, didn't it?
Yeah, intensive early stocking was started back in the Flint Hills probably, 50 years ago.
Right.
That system of grazing takes the number of animals that would usually or typically be stocked on a pasture at the start of the year, takes that number and doubles it. So you have twice the density, but those animals only graze through half the season, through the first part of the season. That first part of the growing season is when the grass is most nutritious, highest in quality, and those animals gain more. So have increased number of animals on those pastures when the grass is highest in quality. And then they're removed. So you end up having the same stocking rate on those pastures because twice the density grazed for half the year equals the same 1x stocking rate for the whole year. Out here in western Kansas and also in eastern Kansas, K-State's been looking at doing some research where we have intensive early stocking where we increase the density early in the season, but yet we only remove a portion of those animals midway through the season. So out here I call it modified intensive early stocking. And in eastern Kansas, Clinton Owensby, the researcher that's doing it in eastern Kansas, he calls it IES plus late season grazing. But the concept is basically the same, where we're having a greater density of animals on pasture early in the season when the grass is most nutritious, removing some of those animals, and then the ones that remain on pasture through to the end of the season at a lower stocking density, they have a greater ability then to go out and select the highest quality plants they can, leaves and species, to get the highest quality diet that they can during the last half of the season to put on more weight. So basically we're trying to capture on the best of both worlds, having highest quality early for a large number of animals and then allowing a smaller number of animals to get their highest quality diet late in the season.
A few years back now, you then came up with the idea that this system might well work for the breeding herd, the cow herd, out on grass. What led you in that direction, Keith?
Well, basically I was trying to figure out a way to capitalize on that increase in production because we were able to increase our production per acre by 26% out here on research that we did at Hays. with stalker steers. Because western Kansas is dominated more by cow-calf pairs, we were looking to find some way where we could get that production increase, not just from stalker steers, but try to incorporate it into the cow-calf herd. And so we started a study where we were trying to use the same concept of a higher density early in the season and then lowering the stocking density and stocking rate late in the season to try to capture as much of that production increase that we could with cow-calf pairs.
And in the case of the cow, what you're looking for here is how well their body condition score holds up as they go through breeding and then the post-breeding season.
Yeah, that's pretty much correct. We're stocking at a greater density of cow-calf pairs on a pasture early in the season, and then in order to decrease the stocking rate late, we're actually early weaning the calves. That's how we get the reduction in stocking late in the season, so that we have a group of cows that have their calves early weaned in the summertime. We're keeping track then of cow weight and body condition score to see how that increase in stocking density early in the season affects their body condition and whether or not we have too many animals out on pasture early in the season and whether or not that early weaning allows them to maintain body condition or increase body condition to the level of those that are stock continuous.
So you've been running this study for 5 years, starting in 2015, over the following 4 seasons through 2019. What has been the impact of this approach on body condition score, on the cow's ability to maintain those calves before they're weaned, and so forth?
Well, we have 2 different locations where we've utilized these treatments, the modified intensive early stock treatment and the season-long stock treatment, the typical continuous cow-calf stocking. We have 2 different locations where we have both treatments at each location. And to start off at both locations, of course, we had cows in both treatments that had similar weight and similar body condition score to start the experiment. After the first season, where we weaned calves early in that modified system, those cows then at the end of the year, in fall of the year, had a higher body condition score that very first season. So in one season, those cows in the modified system were able to have a higher body condition score. And then that higher body condition score in the fall carried over into the spring. And each year since then, our cows in the modified system have maintained a higher body condition score to start the year and also to the end of the year because they're being early weaned. Now, at the time of early weaning, the body condition score has actually been the same between the 2 treatments in July. So those cows in the modified system, they're stocked at 1.45 times the density of the continuous stocked cows. So that greater density, they are losing some condition at the start of the year. But because they're being early weaned at the mid-season, they are gaining that back before the fall. So they have a higher body condition score at the end of the season, almost 100 pounds per cow, greater weight, and that is carried over into the spring where we start with cows that also have a higher body weight and body condition score. Cow final conception rate has been greater for the modified system versus the continuous system. That could be attributed probably to starting off the season with a higher body condition score.
There's another side of this, though, that you're equally interested in, Keith, and that is the impact of running this program for successive years on the grass resource itself. Elaborate on that, if you would.
Yeah, with change in stocking rate and stocking density, one thing that we're very concerned about is how this is going to affect pasture productivity and the plant species that make up that biomass out in the pasture. So we've been monitoring permanent transects that we have in each of these pastures over the 5 years. And essentially there has been no difference in available forage at the midpoint of the growing season in July or at the end of the growing season and when cows were removed from pasture in the fall. So it has not had a great effect at all on amount of dry matter available to cows throughout the growing season. I do have to say, though, at the end of this last growing season, the end of the 5th year, there was a margin between the continuous and the modified pastures as far as biomass available, forage available at the end of the year. It was not statistically different, but it was a gap that was basically 2 times greater than the margin between pastures at any other time period that we've measured. Just under a 300-pound per acre difference between the 2 pasture treatments. And so that's something that we really need to keep our eye on in this next growing season, is to see if that gap continues, because it could be an indicator that pasture trend is going to be declining and going to be less productive, and we may find that this has been the 5th year and going into the 6th year. That may be the maximum that we could expect for these pastures to sustain this system.
You have information that you put together for the K-State Beef Research Roundup 2020 at Hayes that folks can take a look at if they'd like on this particular topic, don't you, Keith?
Yes, and it's available online through what's called the New Prairie Press. You can go onto New Prairie Press, onto their website, and type in K-State Roundup, and it should be one of the options that first pops up as a summary of this 2020 Roundup report.
And that report by title is Using Modified Intensive Early Stocking for Cow-Calf Production. Keith, good work as always. Anxious to see what you find out next concerning this system. Appreciate your time right here.
Yeah, well, I'm curious to find out what happens this year as well, and thanks for having me on.
Keith Harmoney, rangeland scientist at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. And we'll be back with more on Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network, and with more for you cow-calf producers as you ready to turn the herd out on summer pasture. Some thoughts on sizing up that pasture's carrying capacity, as well as guarding against a key mineral deficiency as the cow herd enjoys that lush grass growth in late spring and early summer. All of this was covered in a recent Cattle Chat podcast out of K-State's Beef Cattle Institute. In on the conversation this time, cow-calf specialist Bob Weaber and veterinarians Bob Larson and Brad White, who also serves as moderator.
It's not quite time yet to turn the cows out, but what are some of the things that we want to think about before we turn the cows out to grass? And then as they get onto grass, we're going to talk a little bit about grass tetany, which is a condition that cows can get as they're grazing that lush green forage.
Well, I think historically we get really optimistic as producers to think about the amount of grass that's out there. Just because it's green doesn't mean that there's necessarily enough nutrient value for those cows. And so monitoring body condition score on cows pre-breeding is a really important thing to do. But we also want to make sure that, as we turn those cows to grass, that they've got sufficient forage available to continue to nurse calves and hopefully be in a positive plane of nutrition as they go into breeding. So forage assessment or inventory is a really key step that we take into account this time of year.
Yeah, what Dr. Weber said is when I've been around people that I consider really good grass managers, really good, grazers, is they both monitor the cows and the forage availability. And it's pretty dynamic. It changes throughout the grazing season. And right now we're right at the very beginning. So things that happened last year, the amount of forage left over from last year that might be dormant but available, the amount of rainfall leading up to this time of year, all impact this early season grazing. And the situation might change as we get in a couple of months, a little bit deeper into the grazing season. So a continued monitoring. So what I hear you saying, Dr. Weber, is, well, assess where we are right now with the body condition score of the cows and the forage availability now, and do some planning for how dense to do the stocking at this point. But keep in mind that you might need to change that as time goes along.
Yeah, and when you're thinking about those pastures, as you talk about assessing, there's some ways to do that. And one of the things, Bob, you mentioned before the show as we were talking, was it's easy, especially at this time of year when we haven't seen green in months, to look at a pasture and say, man, it's looking green. Things are greening up. It's time to turn the cows out. Are there any other tools you might want to use besides driving by rapidly saying that pasture looks green?
Well, Larson and I both spent some time in Missouri, and one of the best things that I learned as an extension specialist was attending a couple of grazing schools and learning more about cool and warm season grasses and how to assess forage availability. And so if you're not up to speed on those tools, I would encourage you to take some time. And there's a lot of online resources available. Kansas Grazing Lands Council is a great resource for some of those, as well as a lot of extension resources and grazing schools around the state. But one of my favorite things is, when you go to one of those grazing schools, you get a stick, and it's a yardstick that's got a whole bunch of calculations on it to go out and figure out and estimate forage availability, and use that to compute appropriate stocking rates and stocking durations for those cows.
And the reason that the stick they give us is a yardstick is because you can go out there and actually just measure the inches, how tall in general is the forage at different times of the year, and keeping track of that so that you're not just estimating. Because sometimes my ability to estimate how tall the grass isn't all that accurate. So taking a yardstick out there and really saying, there's 8 inches or there's 12 inches of forage out here. And typically what you're talking about doing is, as you graze animals through there, is taking about half and leaving about half. That may be a little bit oversimplification, but that's a pretty good rule of thumb. Is so if you've got 8 inches of forage out there right now, plan on taking about 4 inches and leaving 4 inches. And how much forage would that be for the number of cows that we've got?
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is don't overestimate how much feed's out there. It's really easy this time of year to, from the roadside, look across and go, wow, that's really green. There's a lot of forage. But if you take the time to walk out through it, you'll see most of those grass plants have 2 or 3 blades coming up, and there's a fair bit of either dead material, dormant material, or soil in between. And particularly if you've burned off any of those warm season pastures this spring, all that dormant stuff's gone. And so it's really easy to kind of overestimate. I would say in general, about 50 to 100 pounds of dry matter per acre. And remember this, green stuff's really lush and high water content. So the amount of dry matter and nutrient availability is pretty limited sometimes. And so making sure that we get either, some additional dry hay is a great example of, making sure we meet energy requirements on cows. If you're short on hay, 20% range cube, so we get a lot of energy with the appropriate amount of protein, can be really helpful too.
And what about our vaccination program? Is there anything to consider there for this time of year? Because after I turn them out to grass, I may not want to get them back up for a while.
Yeah, working with your veterinarian, because honestly, one of the nice things about beef cows is we've got some options of timing, most appropriate timing of delivering vaccines for mature cows. And that might be here in the spring near turnout time, or it might be in the fall. And so that's one to kind of review with your veterinarian, and don't forget it as you get busy as things come along, so that you are implementing the vaccination program that you and your veterinarian have kind of devised. But it might involve running the cows through a chute and giving their vaccines now, or it may be at a different time of year.
One of the topics that we mentioned earlier, Bob, is I talked about grass tetany. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. It's a little bit early still. We'll see it a little bit later in spring. We get really green, lush growing grass. And we may see a cow that acts a little bit staggery. She may be walking around, wandering. She could be kind of aggressive, or she could be down on the pasture. So what's going on in those cows?
Yeah, grass tetany basically is when the cow doesn't get enough magnesium into their body. And it's associated with springtime of the year and lush growing grass when the soil temperature is not particularly high yet, And so the magnesium level in the plant isn't that high. So this compared to, a lot of times when we talk about mineral deficiencies, we're talking about minerals that are deficient in the soil in a particular geographic area. With magnesium deficiency, it's not really that the soil is deficient. And so you could have perfectly good soil levels of magnesium, but when the soil temperatures are cool, it's not brought up into the plant and the cow's going to get access to it. And so the grass can look very lush and green and still be low in magnesium. As the soil temperatures rise and we get a little bit later into the summer, the plant levels of magnesium get up to normal and it's not a problem anymore. But what you'll see then, so this mineral, what it's doing in the cow, it's helping with the way the nerves work. If you can imagine kind of what it feels like when your leg goes to sleep or something like that, when the nerve conduction isn't right and that animal is not able to get around. And it can affect their brain even. And so you mentioned that sometimes these cows are quite aggressive. So a cow with a typically good attitude might be quite aggressive if she's low in magnesium. So we see the staggering. We see that they're down and can't get up. We could see that they're kind of wanting to attack you if they're low in magnesium. So we address that. If the cow is actually showing those signs, the veterinarian may need to be called and we'll have to give her IV doses, so running some bottles of a high mag mineral supplement into the vein to get her back onto her feet. And then for the group of cows is make sure that you've got a high mag mineral out there for them to consume.
Yep. And if you put that high mag mineral out early in the process, and we talked about a lot of times you're going out to that grass, it looks lush, it looks green, a lot of water content, as you mentioned, different mineral profile than what we'd expect a little bit later in the year. So being sure that mineral is out. And one of the things that I think is important, put it out, monitor consumption. And so you don't have to actually monitor how much they're going to eat, but how often does it go empty and do I need to take a bag out there? And I don't want it to be, if I put a bag out and I check next week and it's completely empty, I don't know if it went empty on Wednesday or Thursday or when it did. So I really need to keep a close eye, especially at this time of year.
I agree. And one of the frustrating things is not all cows will eat mineral at the same level that other cows. And so it's very possible that you've delivered a high mag mineral, that the herd in general is consuming it at the appropriate pace, but there's a few cows in there that just don't eat much mineral. And the magnesium that we add to mineral is pretty unpalatable. They don't like the taste of it. So a lot of times these high mag minerals will have some extra molasses or something else to kind of attract them. But there's some cows that just are going to be cantankerous and don't want to eat it. So you could see this grass tetany issues that I described, even in a herd where you're actually doing a pretty good job delivering the high mag mineral. And so you still need to look for those individuals that may not be consuming how much you want them to.
That was part of a recent Cattle Chat podcast produced by the Beef Cattle Institute at Kansas State University and featuring comments from K-State's Brad White, Bob Weaber, and Bob Larson. The podcast in its entirety at beefcattleinstitute.org, beefcattleinstitute.org. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll return with more after this break. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so we should all stay home to lower the risk for everyone. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether, brought to you by the Ad Council.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you as we forge ahead now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the USDA has offered up this week's Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report. For the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies in the state were called 8% surplus, 61% adequate, and 31% short to very short, while subsoil moisture is at 5% surplus, 69% adequate, and 26% short to very short. The condition of the winter wheat crop slipped considerably from last week, 40% now good to excellent. That's down a good 10% from the previous week, and 20% is poor to very poor, 40% is called fair. Winter wheat jointing at 64% now. That's behind the 72 average for the date, and headed wheat is at 2%. That's behind the 17% average for this date. Corn planting in Kansas, 24% complete. That's behind the average of 31%. And corn emergence is at 3% now. That's behind the average of 10%. And soybeans now planted at 2% of the acreage. That's very near the average for Kansas for this date. Nationally, corn planting progress leaped ahead this past week, putting this year's pace ahead of the 5-year average. NASS estimates that 27% of this year's intended corn crop was planted as of Sunday. That's a gain of 20 percentage points last week from 7% at the end of the previous week. And this puts this year's progress 7 points ahead of the 5-year average of 20%. Notable corn planting progress seen in Illinois, now at 37%, Iowa 39%, Nebraska at 20%, and Minnesota at 40%. And nationally, soybean planting moved ahead last week, but at a slower pace than corn. NASS estimating that as of Sunday, 8% of the intended soybean crop was planted. That's ahead of the 5-year average of 4%. And the winter wheat conditions overall taking another hit, with NASS estimating 54% of the nation's winter wheat crop now in good to excellent condition, poor to very poor ratings rising to 15%. The notable state winter wheat good to excellent ratings, again, Kansas at 40%, Nebraska 64%, Oklahoma at 62%, and Texas at 57%. Sorghum planting now underway, 20% planted. That is behind the 5-year average of 23% for the date. Coming your way next, this week's edition of Milk Lines. With that, as always, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning harvesting your small grain forage for silage. Next few weeks, we will be harvesting a lot of our wheat and triticale and rye and other small grain crops that we've grown over winter for our dairy animals. So one of the first things I guess I want you to give a little bit of thought to is what classes of animals on your farm will you be harvesting these forages for? Because depending on the class of animal will really determine what stage of growth that we should really harvest these crops for our animals. So if you're thinking about lactating dairy cows and you're actually thinking about this being a significant part of the forage that they're going to consume, and I usually kind of draw a line, if we're going to be feeding 3 or more pounds of dry matter per head per day to the lactating cows, we really need to be concerned about the quality of that forage and making sure that it has a high level of digestible NDF and digestible dry matter, and also contains good amounts of protein as well. So in order to achieve that, we really need to be harvesting that crop in the boot stage if it's going, again, in larger quantities to our lactating dairy cows. And in the boot stage, that would be before the head actually emerges. Yes, we do give up some tonnage when we do that, but digestible dry matter is really what we're after for those lactating cows. And in that case, we really need to get out there earlier and get that harvested at the correct stage of plant maturity. Now, if you're looking at feeding just a little bit to your lactating cows, essentially using it as a source of effective fiber, and we're only maybe feeding a couple pounds of dry matter per head per day or less, then maybe going to the head stage is where you want to be. Again, you're looking for effective fiber in a limited quantity, so having a forage that's a little more mature may help you with that. Now, if you're figuring that this forage is going to go to dry cows or heifers, then probably you really need to think about the head stage, and that could be, up to almost soft dough stage if you want. And again, making sure that we maintain a harvest moisture that's appropriate for silage. So trying to keep that dry matter somewhere between about 35% and 38% would really be our goal there, even though we're harvesting the plant at a little bit more mature stage. Now, one of the things I'd encourage you to do is, sit down with your dairy nutritionist, talk about how much of this type of forage for these different classes of animals you might need in the next year, or a shorter period of time if that is what you want to do, and then start thinking about how you're going to time harvest. And if you're harvesting for more than one class of animals, then obviously you may have a couple of different harvests that you have to deal with. The other thing that we always deal with in the spring is just the harvest conditions, the weather conditions that are going on during the harvest time. So maybe you plan to harvest at the boot stage, but we get a lot of rain and the heads have emerged by the time that you actually were able to get in the fields and do the harvesting. Well, again, you need to think about how you're going to be utilizing that on your dairy farm. And if you really intended to have a higher quality forage for your lactating cows, and now you do not, you need to think about how you're going to utilize that forage. You can still utilize it with the lactating cows if it's of more mature quality. However, probably going to cost you some milk production when you do that. So again, visit with your nutritionist, make those decisions. As we're thinking about small grain harvest, whether or not we put it in bags, we put it into a bunker or drive over pile. Think about face management. If you're only going to be feeding smaller quantities per day, encourage you to think about maybe using bags to store this in. If you're running a large operation where you feed large quantities daily, then the pile or the bunker silo may make sense in terms of face size for that. So again, Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to think about small grain silage harvest as it comes up and spend some time with their nutritionist identifying how much of these different qualities forage that we may need to operate our dairies.
Thanks for covering all that, Mike, and we will return shortly on Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, K-State Research and Extension Wildlife Specialist Charlie Lee with his weekly input on another facet of wildlife management. The purpose this time around, Charlie, to understand further damage created by turkeys to crop ground and otherwise out on the land. And you bring this up because right around now, in the springtime, turkeys and their activities pretty conspicuous out there, you say.
Yes, wild turkeys were reintroduced into Kansas in the 1960s, and the program has been a great success. Today, there are huntable populations of turkeys in almost every county. There are a few areas in the extreme southwest that only provide limited amount of hunting. And of course, those turkey populations rise and fall depending on weather events. But this is the time of year when people see turkeys in newly planted crop fields and automatically assume that they're doing damage.
And folks assume that because they are so numerous and so active?
Well, they're numerous. They're out there during the daylight period. They're very visible in a newly planted crop field. It's easy to see turkeys, although the flocks are not as large as they are in fall or winter. The damage occurs or is perceived to occur because the crops are newly planted, they're young, perhaps they're more vulnerable to damage, and producers are looking for reasons why their plant population isn't what they had expected.
So what do we know about the usual extent of that damage? This will get to a recent research review by the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, you tell us.
Yes, there's a publication on real and perceived damage by wild turkeys, a literature review. It did a good job of examining the published, peer-reviewed, peer-refereed literature and trying to document whether wild turkeys are responsible for the damage complaints in which they're implicated, or perhaps they are getting blamed for other species. And certainly wild turkeys have been implicated in damage. They had found 7 peer-reviewed papers and 5 peer-edited papers, 13 publications that are concerning agricultural damage caused by turkeys. But that agricultural damage is often confused with damage by other wildlife species. Wild turkeys have a very broad forage habits, and agricultural foods comprise an important part of their diet, perhaps as much as 50%. And where it's available, waste corn can account for 77% of the agricultural component of turkeys' diets. But that doesn't mean that wild turkeys are actually causing crop damage. It just means that they may be eating waste grain that's in the field rather than digging up corn seed or damaging crop seedlings. In a publication from Indiana that looked at over 500,000 recorded events of crop depredation in corn and soybean fields, raccoons and white-tailed deer were responsible for most of the damage, with white-tailed deer for 97% of the damage to corn, and woodchucks were responsible for 99% of the damage from soybeans. So that leaves wild turkeys way out of the running.
So this review would indicate that turkey damage to crops is vastly overstated. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that would be an accurate representation. There's also been some studies that looked at crops of wild turkeys that were shot in pre-harvest soybean fields. That would be a fall type situation, but there were no evidence of soybeans in those crops, but rather insects and waste grain from previous growing seasons. There certainly is damage that may occur to individual plants. That's usually caused by the turkeys dusting or sifting fine soil throughout their feathers to rearrange the barbs on the feathers and perhaps reduce insects. That may damage individual plants, but it seldom rises to the level of a significant damage. Most of the damage that crop farmers reported has been less than $500 per crop. Although many farmers estimate that there's economic loss caused by wild turkeys, when they are asked to put an amount to that damage, it's seldom more than $500 to $700.
So it's comparatively light, that damage economically. Still, if one is inclined, they can, to some extent, manage wildlife damage, turkeys or otherwise, to their crops?
Sure. There are methods available to manage damage by wild turkeys, just like there is for many other species of wildlife. Those techniques vary depending upon where they're applied in agricultural crops or urban or suburban areas, where turkeys are also implicated in some types of damage. Woven wire and mesh fences have worked very well to exclude turkeys from areas. Wild turkeys prefer to walk rather than fly, so fences interrupt their trails and patterns. You can use pyrotechnics to harass turkeys. They can disperse turkeys throughout the year. There's also some chemical repellents, including methylanthranilate, that can be sprayed on areas that's going to deter foraging by turkeys. Or an alternative technique is to gain some income by leasing the hunting rights for turkey hunters on some of those crop areas or woodland areas that are adjacent to crop fields to offset that perceived damage by wild turkeys. Turkey hunting is a very popular sport. People are willing to pay for access. That may be a way for some folks to offset that perceived damage.
So it can be dealt with, but once again, this scientific review out of the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, would indicate that turkey damage to crops is generally not as severe as many would think, despite their activity out there in the springtime. Charlie, thanks for the look at this today. Wildlife specialist Charlie Lee of K-State Research. and Extension. And our time's away for today. As always, thanks to you for being along with us. Remember to check out our podcast service at agtoday.net. Meantime, looking forward to having you right back here tomorrow. Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.